Hello, everyone. We think we know what hobbies are, but the Victorians took it to a different level. Today, we might collect stamps or play video games, but back then, they actually played with dead things. I'm talking about wealthy people unwrapping stolen mummies at parties like they were opening birthday presents. I'm talking about people weaving jewelry out of human hair, or dressing up dead squirrels for fancy tea parties. It sounds like a nightmare, but it was just a normal afternoon for them. I'm just a guy reading stories, so hit that subscribe button if you want to stay for the weird history. Also, do me a favor and let me know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Now, let's look at what people did for fun before television existed. They didn't have Netflix, so they had to get creative with whatever was lying around. Usually, that was a corpse. Think about your great-great-great-grandfather. If he lived in the early 1800s, his life was basically a loop of manual labor. You woke up before the sun, you pushed a plow or hauled coal until your back felt like it was going to snap, and then you went home to a dark room to eat and pass out. Your hobby was staying alive. But right around the middle of the century, the world flipped on its head. Everything changed because of these massive, soot-covered factories. We call it the Industrial Revolution, but for the average person, it was just the era where they finally got to go home while the sun was still up. These weren't the super-rich royals, but they weren't starving in the dirt anymore either. They had jobs in offices or managed shops, and most importantly, they had a few coins left over at the end of the week. This created a massive problem that humans hadn't really dealt with on a large scale before: boredom. Imagine you're sitting in your new living room. It's 1855. You've got a little money in your pocket. You've got your Saturday afternoon off because your boss actually started giving you a break. But what do you actually do with yourself? You can't scroll through your phone. You can't go to the movies. You can't even turn on a light bulb. It's just you, your family, and a very quiet house. At the exact same time, they had hours to fill and no entertainment industry to fill them. That's where Queen Victoria comes in. You might think of her as this stern old lady in black who never smiled, but back then she was the ultimate influencer. She was the original trendsetter. If Victoria decided she liked a certain kind of dog, everyone in England suddenly needed that dog. If she started collecting pressed flowers, every shop in London sold out of scrapbooks the next day. She didn't just rule the country, she told everyone how to live their lives when the workday was over. She turned the idea of having a hobby into a status symbol. If you had a hobby, it meant you were successful enough to have free time. It was a way to show off. But the thing is, the Victorians were also a bit obsessed with the dark side of life. They lived in a world where death was everywhere. They didn't have modern medicine, so people died young and they died often. It wasn't something they hid away in hospitals. It happened right there in the house. So when they started looking for ways to fill those long, empty hours, they didn't just go for knitting or painting. They took that obsession with death and turned it into some of the strangest pastimes you've ever heard of. They had the money to buy tools, they had the time to practice, and they had a weirdly high tolerance for things that would make us lose our lunch today. They weren't just bored, they were bored and slightly morbid. This combination led them down some truly strange paths. They wanted to touch everything, label everything, and keep everything, even if that meant bringing a bit of the graveyard home with them. It was a race to see who could have the most unique or the most shocking collection on their shelf. And things got very weird very fast. To understand why someone would want a dead squirrel in their living room, you have to understand the world they lived in. Back then, death wasn't some spooky secret hidden away in hospitals or funeral homes. It was just the neighbor you saw every single day. If you lived in a big city in the 1800s, you couldn't walk a block without seeing it. Disease was everywhere. You had cholera in the water, the air was thick with coal smoke, and a simple cold could finish you off by the weekend. People died at home, in their own beds, with their families watching. Because they saw it so often, the fear kind of just wore off. It's like living next to a loud train track. After a while, you don't even hear the noise anymore. The Victorians stopped being terrified of the Reaper and started getting curious about him. They didn't want to run away from the end. They wanted to take a closer look. This led to a strange kind of obsession. If death was going to be part of the furniture anyway, they figured they might as well make it look nice. At the same time, the world was suddenly getting much bigger. Explorers were coming back from places most people had never heard of, bringing back stories of weird animals and strange plants. This gave everyone a massive case of FOMO. They wanted to see it all for themselves. But they didn't just want to look at nature, they wanted to own it. They had this huge urge to control everything. The natural world felt big, messy, and dangerous, so they tried to shrink it down. Their solution was to put things in boxes. If they found a cool bird, a pretty leaf, or a weird-looking bug, they didn't just leave it there. They killed it, dried it out, and stuck it behind a sheet of glass. It was about power. If you put a piece of nature in a box on your shelf, it couldn't hurt you anymore. It belonged to you. You were the boss of that little piece of the forest now. Your living room became a tiny version of the wild, but one that you could control with a duster. This is why their hobbies weren't about doing things like we do today. They weren't out there going for a jog or taking a painting class to relax. They were hoarders of the physical world. They wanted stuff they could touch, stack, and show off to their friends. If a hobby didn't result in a physical object you could put on a mantelpiece, it basically didn't count. The more stuff you had, the more cultured you looked. Now, you have to remember that science was the new rock and roll back then. It was the big, exciting thing that everyone was talking about. Charles Darwin was a household name, and everyone wanted to feel like they were part of the big discovery. But here was the problem. Most people had no clue how science actually worked. They didn't have the internet or a library in their pocket. They were like kids who got a complicated new toy but lost the instruction manual. So they just winged it. They treated science like a giant garage sale. They grabbed whatever looked interesting and made up their own rules about it. They thought that by sticking a bunch of dried ferns in a book or pinning butterflies to a board, they were doing serious research. They were playing scientist without doing any of the actual math or logic. It was a mix of genuine curiosity and total confusion. They wanted the trophy, not the lesson. And as the Victorian era hit its peak, this mix of being comfortable with death and being obsessed with owning nature turned into some of the most bizarre hobbies humans have ever come up with. Think about how we get obsessed with things today. One week, everyone is into baking bread. The next week, everyone is buying a specific kind of water bottle. Now, take that energy and crank it up to a level that actually gets people killed. That is exactly what happened with ferns. I know it sounds like a joke. How could a plant that grows in the cracks of a sidewalk be dangerous? But in the mid-1800s, Britain caught what doctors literally called fern fever. The fancy name for it was Pteridomania, But basically, it just meant people stopped acting like rational human beings the second they saw a frond. It all started because ferns were seen as pure. So if you had a house full of ferns, it meant you were a good person. But it didn't stay a quiet little hobby for long. It turned into a high-stakes competitive sport. Imagine you're a woman in the 1850s. You're wearing a heavy corset, a massive hoop skirt, and layers of petticoats. You're supposed to stay home and pour tea, but instead you're out in the middle of a thunderstorm, scrambling up a wet, jagged cliffside in Devon. You're digging your fingernails into the mud and risking a 200-foot drop. Why? Because you saw a specific type of sea spleenwort growing in a crevice, and you'll be damned if your neighbor gets it before you do. This wasn't just a few weirdos either. Thousands of women were doing this. They'd pack fern hunting kits with trowels and bags and head into the wilderness. It was one of the few times they were allowed to leave the house without a chaperone, so they went absolutely wild with it. The men were just as obsessed, but they tended to throw money at the problem. If a wealthy guy wanted a rare fern from the other side of the country, he wouldn't just go for a walk. He'd hire professional guides to trek into dangerous ravines. He'd pay teams of laborers to dig up entire sections of a forest. It was like a gold rush, but for greenery. People were stripping the countryside bare. They'd go to a famous waterfall, and instead of looking at the view, they'd rip every single fern out of the rocks until there was nothing left but brown dirt. Some species of ferns that had been around for thousands of years were wiped out in just a few decades because of this. But here's the catch. If you lived in a big city like London, you couldn't actually grow a fern. The air was a nightmare. Between the coal fires and the factories, the smog was so thick it would kill a plant in a day. You might as well have been trying to grow a garden inside an exhaust pipe. That's when a guy named Nathaniel Ward changed everything. He was a doctor who accidentally discovered that if you put a plant inside a sealed glass box, it could survive on its own moisture. He created what we now call a terrarium, but back then they called them Wardian cases. These things were the must-have tech of the era. They were basically life support systems for plants. Suddenly you could have a tiny, perfect jungle right in your smog-filled living room. People went nuts for them. They built massive, ornate glass cases that looked like tiny cathedrals. They put them in their windows, on their dining tables, and even in their bathrooms. If you didn't have a Wardian case filled with rare ferns, you were basically a nobody.
As the demand went up, so did the danger. The easy-to-reach ferns were all gone. If you wanted the good stuff, you had to go where nobody else dared to go. This is where it gets dark. People started dying. You'd read reports in the newspapers about hikers who slipped on loose slate while reaching for a leaf. There's one story of a woman who was so focused on a fern growing over a high ledge that she stepped right off the cliff. She died with the plant still clutched in her hand. Another guy fell into a deep crevice in a cave and wasn't found for days. It wasn't just accidents either. People started stealing. Fern raiding became a real crime. Gangs would break into private estates at night, not to steal the silver, but to dig up the rare ferns in the garden. They'd sell them on the black market for huge prices. It was a total frenzy. People were risking prison and death for something you can buy at a grocery store today for $5. They were bored, they were competitive, and they were obsessed with owning a piece of the wild, even if that piece of the wild ended up being the last thing they ever touched.
So you've got your stuffed tiger or your preserved bird on the shelf, and you think you're the talk of the town. But for the Victorians, just having a dead animal sit there wasn't enough. They were competitive, remember? They wanted more. They wanted their animals to do something. They wanted them to act like people. This is where we get into the truly bizarre world of anthropomorphic taxidermy. I know that's a big word, but it basically just means stuffing animals and posing them like they're human. It's exactly as weird as it sounds. The man who really turned this into an art form was a guy named Walter Potter. He wasn't some high society scientist or a big city artist. He was just a guy who ran a pub in a tiny village in Sussex. When he was a teenager, his sister's pet canary died. Most people would have just buried it in the backyard, but Walter decided to stuff it. That started a lifelong obsession. He didn't just want to preserve animals, he wanted to build entire worlds for them. Eventually, he opened a museum right next to his pub, and it became one of the most popular places in England. People would travel for miles to see what he'd come up with, and what they saw was honestly incredible, even if it makes our skin crawl a bit today. His most famous piece was called The Kitten's Wedding. Imagine a big glass case. Inside, you've got 20 different kittens. They aren't just standing there. They're dressed in full Victorian wedding gear. You've got a bride in a white lace dress and a veil. You've got a groom in a mourning suit. There are bridesmaids carrying tiny bouquets and guests watching from the pews. They even have tiny gold rings and little prayer books. To the Victorians, this wasn't creepy at all. They thought it was the cutest thing they'd ever seen. It was wholesome family fun. But Walter didn't stop at weddings. He had a scene with squirrels that's even more ridiculous. He took a bunch of squirrels and set them up at a club. They were sitting around wooden tables, playing poker, and passing around tiny glasses of beer. Some of them even had little pipes in their mouths, like they were having a serious talk about the economy. He spent years on these scenes. Every little detail had to be perfect. If a squirrel was supposed to be holding a winning hand of cards, Walter made sure those cards were tiny and real. One of his most complex works involved rats. He didn't just put 2 or 3 of them together. He built a whole courtroom. It was a criminal trial for a rat who had supposedly committed a crime. You had a rat judge sitting up high with a wig on. You had a rat jury looking very serious in their box. There was a rat prisoner in the dock and rat policemen standing at the doors with little uniforms. It was a massive production. Now, you're probably asking yourself where a guy in a small village gets 20 kittens and a dozen squirrels and a whole pack of rats. People often think he was out there hunting them down, but that's not really how it worked. Because Walter was so famous, the whole community helped him out. If a farmer's cat had a litter of kittens that didn't make it, or if someone found a dead squirrel in the park, they didn't throw it away. They brought it to the pub. They'd walk in, grab a pint, and hand Walter a dead animal in a box. He became the guy who gave these animals a second life, even if that life involved wearing a dress or playing cards. The process was pretty gross. He'd have to skin them, treat the fur so it wouldn't rot, and then build these little wire frames to hold them up. He had to be part tailor, part carpenter, and part surgeon, and he did it all in his spare time. The crazy thing is how much people loved this stuff. We think of the Victorians as being very stiff and proper, but they went wild for these displays. It was their version of a blockbuster movie. Thousands of people flocked to his museum every year. Parents brought their children, and schools took field trips there. It stayed open for over 100 years because the demand never really went away. They didn't see the death. They saw a story. They saw a funny, tiny version of their own lives reflected back at them in the glass eyes of a stuffed rat. To them, it wasn't about being macabre. It was about taking the boring reality of a dead animal and turning it into something they could finally relate to. But if you think keeping a dead squirrel on your mantle was the limit, You haven't seen what they did with their own family members. I'm not talking about photos or paintings. I'm talking about physical pieces of people, specifically their hair. See, back then, you couldn't just pull out your phone and look at a picture of your mom if you missed her. And if she died, you really didn't have much to hold on to. So, the Victorians did what they did best. They got practical and a little bit weird. They started cutting the hair off their dead relatives and turning it into jewelry. I know what you're thinking. That sounds like something out of a horror movie. But to a Victorian woman in 1860, this wasn't gross at all. It was the height of fashion. It was actually considered very romantic. If you loved someone, you wanted a piece of them with you at all times. And hair is great for that because it doesn't rot. It stays the same long after everything else is gone. They didn't just snip a lock and put it in a locket either. They went way further. It became a huge DIY hobby. Every popular ladies' magazine at the time had instructions on how to do this at home. First, you had to get the hair. If a friend or a family member passed away, you'd wait until they were laid out, and then you'd take your scissors. You'd cut the longest locks you could find from the back of the head. Once you had the hair, you couldn't just start working with it. It was dirty. You had to prep it. You'd take that hair and soak it in a bowl of water mixed with a little bit of soda. You had to be careful not to let it all get tangled into a big bird's nest. After it was clean, you didn't just let it air dry. You actually had to boil it. You'd put the hair in a pot on the stove and let it bubble for a while. This did two things. It killed any bugs or lice that might be hiding in there, and it stripped away all the natural oils. This made the hair stiff and easier to braid. After the hair was boiled and dried, you'd sort it by length. Then you'd get out your braiding table. This was a special piece of furniture with a hole in the middle. You'd sit at the table and divide the hair into small bunches. You'd tie little lead weights to the ends of the hair to keep them tight. Then you'd start crossing the strands over each other. It was a lot like making those friendship bracelets you might have made as a kid, but way more complicated. You'd move the weights around in a specific order to create patterns. They made all kinds of stuff. They made rings, bracelets, and even long chains for pocket watches. If they had enough hair, they'd make these massive wall decorations called wreaths. They would take the hair and wrap it around thin wires to make it look like flowers or leaves. Then they'd frame it and hang it in the living room. The crazy part is how they used these things. They didn't just keep them in a box. They wore them out in public. Imagine you're at a fancy dinner party. You're sitting there eating your soup, and you look at the woman next to you. She's wearing this incredibly intricate dark brown necklace. It looks like fine lace from a distance. You lean in and tell her it's a beautiful piece of jewelry. She smiles and tells you, "Thanks. It's actually made from her 3 children who died of the flu last winter." And you wouldn't be shocked. You'd probably ask her what kind of braid pattern she used. You might even ask if she has the instructions so you can make one for your dead uncle. It was a conversation starter. It showed people that you were a good person who loved your family. It showed you had the patience to sit for 50 hours and weave a bracelet out of a ghost's hair. The patterns they made were actually pretty impressive. They could make the hair look like little acorns or waves or even tiny braided ropes. Sometimes they'd mix hair from different people. You could have a friendship bracelet that had hair from 5 different living friends all woven together. But the mourning jewelry was the big seller. They'd even add little gold clasps or tiny pearls, which represented tears. When you look at it that way, it's not really about death. It's about not wanting to let go. They lived in a world where people died young all the time. They didn't have modern medicine, so they grabbed onto whatever they could. If that meant boiling your grandmother's hair and wearing it as a ring, then that's what you did. It turned a cold, sad memory into a physical object you could touch and show off to your neighbors. To them, it was just a way to keep the people they loved close, even if they were already in the ground. But keeping a piece of your dead relative's hair in a locket was just the beginning. If you think that's a bit much, you haven't seen what the Victorians did when they wanted to throw a real party. You see, the middle class and the wealthy had a lot of money and even more free time. They were bored. And when they got bored, they didn't just look for hobbies. They looked for things that were big, expensive, and a little bit gross. That's how we ended up with the mummy unrolling party. It all started because travel was becoming a big deal. You had guys like Thomas Cook starting the first travel agencies, and suddenly, if you had the cash, you could hop on a boat and head to Egypt. It was the hot new destination. But people didn't just go there to look at the sights and take notes. They went there to shop. And I don't mean they were buying postcards or little statues. They were buying people. Back then, you could literally walk into a marketplace in Cairo or Luxor and find locals selling ancient mummies. They were everywhere. They were so common that some people were using them as firewood or grinding them up to make a specific shade of brown paint. But for a wealthy British traveler, a mummy was the ultimate souvenir. You'd pick one out, haggle over the price like you were buying a rug, and then pay to have it boxed up. You'd have this heavy wooden crate put on a ship and sent thousands of miles across the ocean back to London. It was like ordering a piece of furniture, except the furniture used to have a name, a job, and a family. Once that crate showed up at your front door, you didn't just open it and stick the mummy in the corner. That would be a waste of a perfectly good social opportunity. You had to make it an event. You'd sit down at your desk and start writing. You would send out formal printed invitations to all your friends and neighbors. These weren't scribbled notes either. They looked like wedding invites. And you can bet people didn't say no. If you got an invite like that, you cleared your calendar. On the day of the party, everyone would show up in their best clothes. The men would be in suits, and the women would be in those massive, heavy dresses. They'd gather in the host's living room, or maybe a private lecture hall if the guy was really fancy. There'd be tea, there'd be snacks, and right in the middle of the room, there'd be a long table with a dusty, linen-wrapped shape lying on top of it. Then the host would step up. Sometimes they'd hire a guy who claimed to be an expert, but usually the host just did it himself. He'd grab a pair of heavy scissors or a sharp surgical knife. He'd stand at the head of the table like he was about to carve a Sunday roast. He'd find a loose edge of the linen and start cutting. You have to understand, these bandages weren't soft. They were thousands of years old and soaked in resin and sand. They were hard as a rock. The host would have to saw through the layers, and as he did, clouds of ancient dust would fly up into the air. Everyone in the front row would start coughing and waving their hands to clear the air, but nobody moved an inch. They were glued to the spot. They wanted to see what was inside. It wasn't a fast process. There were miles of linen wrapped around these bodies. It could take hours. The host would peel back a few layers and find something tucked into the wraps. This was the part where everyone would cheer. He'd pull out a little gold beetle called a scarab, or a small stone eye, or a piece of jewelry. He'd hold it up for the room to see, and the guests would go wild. He'd pass these things around. Imagine sitting there, sipping your tea, and your friend hands you a lucky charm that some priest tucked into a burial wrap 3,000 years ago. You'd look at it, poke it, and pass it to the person next to you. As the host got closer to the actual body, things got even more intense. He'd peel away the final layers of the face. Sometimes the skin was still there, stretched tight over the skull like dark old leather. Sometimes the eyelashes were still attached. The guests would lean in as close as they could get. They weren't horrified. They were fascinated. They'd talk about the shape of the nose or the set of the teeth. They were looking at a person who hadn't breathed in millennia, and they were treating it like a magic trick at a birthday party. But there was one thing that no one could ignore, and that was the smell. The second those inner bandages came off, a scent would hit the room that you couldn't describe. It was a mix of old spices, chemical resins, and, well, old human. It was thick and heavy. Some people wrote in their journals that the smell was so bad it made their eyes water and their throats itch. But even then, they didn't leave. They stayed until the very last strip of cloth was gone. Sometimes the mummy would be put in a glass case and displayed in the hallway to impress future guests. Other times, the body was just thrown away once the fun part was over. I've even heard stories of people taking the leftover bandages and using them as rags around the house. The guests would head home, maybe with a small bead or a piece of ancient linen in their pocket, talking about what a great time they had. It was just another Saturday night. You went to a party, you watched a guy dissect a corpse, and you were back in bed by 10. To the Victorians, it wasn't disrespectful. It was just the best way they knew how to kill a boring afternoon.
So you're home from the dissection party, and you're probably thinking that Victorians were just obsessed with the gross stuff. But it wasn't just about the spectacle of death. It was about capturing it. Back then, getting your picture taken wasn't like pulling out your phone and snapping a selfie. It was a huge, expensive deal. Most people went their entire lives without ever seeing what they looked like in a photo. A single portrait could cost more than a month's worth of groceries, maybe even your rent. So for the average family, a photographer was a luxury they just couldn't justify while everyone was healthy. They'd say, maybe next year, or maybe when things are better. That's when the panic set in. This was their one and only chance to have a physical memory of the person they loved. Once that person was buried, they were gone forever. No videos, no voicemails, nothing. So they did what any of us would do if we were desperate. They spent the money. They called the photographer, and they didn't wait for the funeral. They did it right then and there, in the living room, while the body was still cold, but before things got, well, messy. You have to understand the pressure the photographer was under. This wasn't just a job. He was a magician. His goal was to make the dead look like they were still part of the family. He didn't want a photo of a corpse. He wanted a photo of a person. To do that, he had to bring a whole kit of tools that would look more at home in a hardware store than a photo studio. He'd show up at the house with heavy iron stands. These things were basically tall metal poles on heavy bases with adjustable clamps at the top. If the family wanted a photo of their daughter standing up, the photographer would slide one of these stands behind her. He'd tuck the metal clamps under her armpits and behind her neck, then tighten the screws until she was propped up straight. He'd hide the base of the stand behind her long dress or cover the pole with a heavy curtain. From the front, if you didn't look too closely at the feet, she looked like she was just leaning against a wall, daydreaming. The biggest problem, though, was the eyes. They sink, or they cloud over, or they just stay shut. This is where the photographer really earned his paycheck. If the eyes were closed, he might take a tiny brush and some paint and literally draw pupils and eyelashes onto the finished photo later. Or if he was really bold, he'd try to prop the eyelids open during the shoot. If that didn't work, he'd just lean into the idea that the person was taking a nap.
He'd pose them on a sofa with a book in their lap or a flower in their hand. He'd tell the family to act like it was just a quiet Sunday afternoon. And that leads to the part that really messes with us today, the siblings. Imagine you're 6 years old. Your baby brother died yesterday. Your parents are crying, the house smells like lilies, and this strange man with a giant wooden box on a tripod is telling you to sit on the sofa. Then they bring out your brother. They sit him right next to you. Maybe he puts his arm around your shoulder. The photographer tells you that you have to sit perfectly still.
Back then, cameras took a long time to capture an image. If you moved, you became a blurry ghost. But your brother, he was the perfect model. He didn't move an inch. So you sit there, holding your breath, holding the hand of a brother who isn't breathing anymore, while the photographer counts down the seconds. The result of all this work was something they called a memento mori. But to these families, it was a treasure. They'd get this small framed glass or metal plate back, and for the first time, they'd see their child's face clearly. They could see the shape of the nose or the curve of the chin. They'd hang these photos on the wall right next to the living members of the family. They didn't see it as creepy. To them, it was the only time the whole family was ever in the same room together for a portrait. It's easy for us to look at these pictures now and feel a bit of a shiver. We see the stiff poses and the weirdly painted eyes, and we think it's a horror movie. But you have to remember that these people lived in a world where you could lose half your kids to a fever before they turned 10. Death wasn't something they hid away in hospitals or funeral homes. It lived in their spare bedrooms. It sat at their dinner tables. Painting eyes on a dead kid wasn't about being weird. It was about holding on. It was their way of saying that even though the heart stopped beating, the person was still there. They were just waiting for the camera to click so they could finally go to sleep. It was the ultimate way to kill the boredom of loss by pretending, just for a second, that nobody was actually gone.
But looking at a photo of a dead relative only got you so far. You could stare at that picture until your eyes hurt, but the person in the frame was never going to talk back. Eventually, the Victorian obsession with death took a weird turn. People stopped being satisfied with just remembering the dead. They wanted to have a conversation with them. It started out as a way to kill time on a rainy Saturday, but it turned into one of the biggest scams in history. You have to remember that back then, technology was moving so fast that most people couldn't keep up. Cameras were new, telegrams were new. To a regular person, the idea of sending a message through a wire wasn't that different from sending a message to a ghost. If a machine could talk to someone in London from a basement in New York, why couldn't it talk to someone in heaven? That's where the photographers saw an opening. They realized they could use the camera to give people exactly what they wanted, proof. He'd take your portrait, and when he developed the plate, there'd be a blurry, faint figure standing right behind you. It looked like a ghost. People lost their minds. They'd see the shape of a woman in a white dress and swear it was their mother who died 5 years ago. But it wasn't a ghost. It was just a trick called double exposure. Mumler would take a glass plate that already had a faint image of someone else on it, maybe a previous customer or a family member, and then he'd use that same plate to take your picture. When the two images overlapped, the first person looked like a see-through spirit. He charged people a ton of money for these. He got rich off people who were so sad they didn't care if the math didn't add up. They just wanted to see their loved ones one more time, and he gave them a piece of paper that proved they were still there. While some people were going to photo studios, others were throwing table-turning parties in their living rooms. This was the ultimate Victorian hobby. You'd get a group of friends together, sit around a heavy wooden table, and everyone would place their hands flat on the surface. You'd sit there in the dark, dead quiet, waiting for a sign. Suddenly, the table would start to vibrate. Then it would tilt. Maybe it would even hop across the floor. Everyone would scream and jump back, convinced a spirit was in the room. But I'll tell you exactly what was actually happening. Most of the time, it was just a physical thing called the ideomotor effect. It's when your muscles move on their own because you're thinking about it so hard. One person's hand would twitch, then the next person would lean in, and pretty soon the whole group was pushing the table without even realizing they were doing it. Of course, sometimes it wasn't an accident. Sometimes there was a prankster in the group who just wanted to freak everyone out. They'd use their knees to lift the edge of the table, or wear a ring with a tiny hook on it to pull the wood up. It was a game. But for people who had just lost a child or a spouse, it wasn't a game at all. It was a lifeline. The whole talking to the dead craze really blew up because of three sisters named Kate, Margaret, and Leah Fox. They were teenagers living in a small house in New York, and they started telling their parents they heard mysterious knocking sounds in the walls. They claimed they had worked out a code with a ghost. 1 knock for yes, 2 for no. This turned into a massive tour. They traveled all over, sitting on stages in front of thousands of people. They'd ask the spirit a question, and a loud crack would echo through the hall. People were terrified. They were amazed. But here's the reality. The girls were just really good at cracking their joints, mostly their big toes. They had practiced until they could pop their toes against the floor or the wooden frame of a bed so loudly that it sounded like a hammer hitting a wall. They did this for years. They made a fortune. It wasn't until decades later that Margaret finally admitted the whole thing was a prank that got out of hand. She showed a reporter exactly how she did it, but by then nobody cared about the truth. They wanted the lie. As the years went on, the tricks got even more ridiculous because the audience got harder to please. People wanted to see more than just a blurry photo or hear a toe crack. They wanted a show. This is when mediums started using things like ectoplasm. If you went to a high-end seance, the medium would sit in a chair and pretend to go into a deep sleep. Then this gross, white, bubbly stuff would start coming out of their mouth or their nose. In reality, it was just cheesecloth. The medium would swallow yards of thin fabric before the show started, or hide it in their clothes, and then slowly pull it out in the dark. Sometimes they'd soak the cloth in chemicals so it would glow, or they'd pin cutout photos of famous people onto the fabric to make it look like faces were floating in the goo. They'd also use spirit trumpets, which were just long metal cones. They'd turn out the lights, and suddenly the trumpet would fly across the room, or a voice would whisper from it. The medium was just picking it up and moving it around while everyone was holding hands. They'd even use secret levers or hidden assistants who would come out of trap doors to ring bells or blow cold air on people's necks. It sounds silly now, but you have to think about the money involved. These weren't just kids playing around. These were professional fraudsters. They would research their clients before they arrived. They'd check local graveyards or look through old newspapers to find out the names of dead relatives. Then, during the seance, the spirit would say a name that only the family should know. It was a total setup. Grieving families would hand over their life savings to these people. They'd pay for private sessions, for more photos, and for blessed items. They were so bored with their quiet, mourning lives and so desperate for a sign of hope that they'd believe a piece of cheesecloth was a message from the other side. They were paying a high price to be lied to, all because they couldn't stand the thought that once someone was gone, they were really gone. But if you couldn't get a ghost to talk back, there were other ways to get close to death. You wanted something you could actually touch, something you could hold in your hand. While some folks were sitting in dark rooms waiting for a knock on a table, others were out in the streets. They were fighting over a piece of rope used to hang a murderer. It sounds pretty gross to us today, but for a Victorian with a lot of free time, a bit of that rope was better than gold. They called this hobby collecting murderabilia. It's a fancy word for a pretty dark habit. Think of it like collecting sports cards, but instead of a famous pitcher, you wanted the guy who killed his neighbor with a shovel. This wasn't just some small group of weirdos either. It was a massive public obsession. People were bored, and nothing cures boredom like a little bit of true crime. Take Jack the Ripper, for example. When those crimes were happening in London, the city was terrified, but they were also fascinated. People didn't just stay inside and lock their doors. They went on tours of the crime scenes while the blood was still fresh on the cobblestones. They bought cheap sketches of the victims. They wanted to be part of the story. It wasn't enough to just read the morning paper. They wanted a souvenir they could keep on the shelf. I'm talking about people literally ripping bricks out of the walls of houses where a crime took place. If a famous killer lived in a certain building, that building was basically a gift shop for the neighborhood. People would show up with hammers. They would knock off a piece of the door frame or grab a stone from the garden. They would take those things home and put them on their mantel. Imagine going over to a friend's house for tea. You look up at the shelf and they say, "Oh, do you like that rock? That is a piece of the cellar where that baker hid the bodies." That was a normal conversation. It was a way to feel the thrill of a crime without actually being in any danger. The biggest prize of all, though, was the hanging rope. Back then, hangings were a public event. Thousands of people would show up to watch. They would bring snacks, they would bring their kids. It was like a festival. But the real action happened after the prisoner was dead. The hangman was the star of the show, and he knew it. He knew he had a gold mine in his hands. Once the job was done, the hangman wouldn't just throw that rope in the trash. He would cut it up into tiny little pieces, maybe an inch or two long. Then he would sell those snips of hemp to the crowd for a few coins each. People would scramble to get one. They would take those little bits of rope and put them inside lockets. They would wear them around their necks like jewelry. Some people thought the rope was a lucky charm. They believed it could cure a headache or bring them money. But mostly they just wanted a piece of history that had actually touched the end of a human life. It was the ultimate "I was there" moment. Now, while some people were busy collecting crime scene trash, others thought they were being a bit more scientific about the whole thing. They didn't just want to see the crime. They wanted to know why the killer did it. They wanted to see inside the mind of a monster. This led to one of the most popular and strangest hobbies of the entire century. It was called phrenology. If you have never heard of it, phrenology was the idea that your brain was like a bunch of muscles. These people thought that if you used one part of your brain a lot, that part would grow bigger. Since your skull is just a thin layer of bone, they believed the growing brain would push the bone out and create a bump. So, by feeling the bumps on someone's head, you could supposedly tell exactly what kind of person they were. There was a bump for greed. There was a bump for kindness. There was even a bump for being secretive. If you had a big lump behind your ear, a phrenologist might tell you that you were a natural-born thief. If the top of your head was flat, they might say you lacked a conscience. It was basically a way to judge people without ever having to talk to them. This didn't stay in doctors' offices, though. It became a total social craze. People started holding head-reading parties. It was the 19th century version of a game night. You would get invited to a fancy house, have a nice dinner, and then everyone would clear the table. You wouldn't play cards or sing songs. Instead, you would take turns sitting in a chair in the middle of the room. Your friends would come up and start rubbing their hands all over your skull. They had these special porcelain heads they would use as a map. These heads were covered in little numbered sections. They would compare your bumps to the map to see if you were a genius or a total disaster. You can imagine how awkward that got. If you were on a date and the person you liked felt a bump of cruelty on your head, that was pretty much the end of the relationship. Parents would even take their babies to get their heads read. They wanted to know if their kid was going to grow up to be a doctor or if they should start worrying about them becoming a criminal. It was a way for people to feel like they had power over the world. They thought they could spot a killer just by looking at them. They thought they could solve the mystery of why people do bad things just by touching a piece of bone. It was a hobby built on a mix of fear and curiosity. They were obsessed with the idea that the secrets of life and death were written right there on the surface if you only knew where to look. They were looking for answers in ropes and rocks and the shape of a forehead, all because they were terrified of what they couldn't see. But as much as they liked to look at the outside of a person, they were about to get even more obsessed with what happened once the breathing stopped for good. So, for a long time, death was just another part of life you could play with. It was something you could dress up, put on a shelf, and show off to your neighbors. But then the world woke up. The party didn't just end, it crashed. And it crashed because the world became a much scarier and much busier place. The biggest reason all these weird hobbies died out was the First World War. Before the war, death was something people saw as romantic or even a bit poetic. It was quiet. It happened at home. You had time to sit with a body and process your feelings. You had time to weave a wreath out of someone's hair. But when 1914 hit, death stopped being a poem and started being a factory. Think about it. You've got millions of young men dying in the mud in France. They weren't coming home to be put in nice coffins in the parlor. Most of the time, they weren't coming home at all. Death became a massive, ugly tragedy that touched every single house on the block. It wasn't something you wanted to decorate your living room with anymore. It was too real. It was too much. If you had a locket with a piece of hair in it, it didn't feel like a sweet hobby. It felt like a punch in the gut. People wanted to look forward, not backward. They wanted to forget the smell of the cemetery, not bring it into their homes. The whole death as a hobby thing started to feel incredibly disrespectful and honestly just plain depressing. At the same time this was happening, science was finally starting to win the argument against dirt. For a long time, people didn't really get how diseases spread. They thought bad air or bad smells made you sick. But then along came germ theory. Scientists started proving that there were tiny little things called bacteria that lived in the grime. And guess what? Those dusty stuffed owls and the piles of human hair you had sitting on your mantel were basically hotels for germs. Doctors started telling people that if they wanted to stay alive, they needed to clean up their houses. They wanted white tiles, fresh air, and empty spaces. All that Victorian clutter, like the dioramas of squirrels having a tea party, started to look like a death trap. People realized that keeping dead things in the house was actually pretty unsanitary. You didn't want a moth-eaten fox in the corner if it was going to make your kids sick. So out went the taxidermy, out went the hair wreaths. People started buying soap instead of stuffing kits. The clean look became the healthy look, and the weird Victorian hobbies just looked gross and dusty. But it wasn't just about war and germs. It was also about the fact that people finally had better things to do. If you think about why someone would spend 100 hours sewing a tiny outfit for a dead toad, the answer is pretty simple. They were bored out of their minds. Before the late 1800s, if you wanted entertainment, you had to make it yourself. You had to sing or play an instrument or build something weird out of scraps. But then technology changed the game. First, the phonograph came along, so you could listen to music without having to play it. Then the radio showed up. Suddenly, you didn't have to sit in a dark room and weave hair to pass the time. You could just turn a dial and hear news or music from the other side of the world. It was easy. It was fast, and it was way more fun than looking at a dead bird. Then the movies happened. Imagine you spent your whole life looking at static scenes of stuffed animals. Then one day you go to a theater and see actual people moving on a screen. It blew people's minds. Why would you want a death hobby when you could go see a comedy or a drama at the cinema? The world was moving faster, and these slow, creepy hobbies just couldn't keep up. People wanted to be part of the modern world. They wanted to go to jazz clubs, watch films, and drive cars. They didn't want to spend their Friday nights playing with a box of dead beetles. By the time the 1920s rolled around, the Victorian era felt like a bad dream. The new generation looked at their parents' stuff and thought it was totally insane. They didn't see the art in a picture frame made of human bone. They just saw a pile of trash that reminded them of a sadder, slower time. They wanted light, they wanted speed, and they wanted to be as far away from death as possible. So the kits were thrown away, the stuffed animals were put in the attic or burned, the hair jewelry was hidden at the bottom of old trunks. We moved from a world where death was a decoration to a world where death was a tragedy we didn't want to talk about at dinner. The Victorian era ended not just because the calendar changed, but because we stopped being afraid of the dark and started being afraid of the germs hiding in it. We traded our weird, handmade hobbies for the glow of the screen and the sound of the radio. And honestly, looking back at some of those hair wreaths, maybe that wasn't such a bad trade after all. But here's the thing about us. We didn't actually stop being weird. We just changed where we put all that energy. You look at those old hair wreaths and think those people were totally out of their minds. But then you look at what we do on a random Tuesday night. We sit on our couches and listen to a 2-hour podcast about a serial killer from the 70s. We listen to the most grisly, awful details while we fold our laundry or wash the dishes. We do this to relax before we go to sleep. When you think about it like that, we really aren't in a position to judge a lady for knitting a picture out of her dead aunt's hair. We both have this strange hunger for the macabre. We just moved the death part from our living room walls to our earbuds. I want you to think about the last time you went down a rabbit hole on the internet. Maybe you spent 3 hours looking at photos of abandoned malls, Or maybe you found yourself on a website like eBay looking at haunted dolls that people are selling for hundreds of dollars. People actually buy those. They click a button, put in their credit card info, and wait for a mailman to bring a creepy possessed toy to their front door. That is a real thing that happens every single day. We are still obsessed with the strange and the supernatural. We just have a faster way to shop for it now. Instead of going to a dusty shop in a back alley, we just use an app while we wait for the bus. The Victorians had their cabinets of curiosities. They filled them with dried bats, weird rocks, and maybe a two-headed pig if they could find one. They wanted to show off the world's mistakes. Today, we have the oddities community. You can go to a convention right now and buy a wet specimen. That is just a fancy way of saying a dead thing in a jar of alcohol. You can buy a sheep's heart or a slice of a brain to put on your bookshelf, and people love it. They take photos of these things and post them online to get likes from strangers. The tools changed, but the goal stayed the exact same. We want to be the person with the weirdest thing in the room. It all comes back to one thing: boredom. Boredom is a powerful force. When the human brain has too much time and not enough to do, it starts to wander into some pretty dark corners. Back then, they didn't have movies or video games. They didn't have a million shows to stream. They had a lot of quiet time and a lot of candlelight. So they picked up some wire and some hair, and they made something. They took the thing they feared the most, death, and they turned it into a craft project. It gave them a sense of control. If you can turn a tragedy into a piece of jewelry, it doesn't feel quite as scary anymore. It gives you something to do with your hands while you process the fact that life is short. We do the same thing today. Life is still scary. The world is still a weird, unpredictable place, so we find our own ways to stay busy. We collect digital items in games that don't even exist in the real world. We spend hours making videos of ourselves, unboxing cardboard packages just to show other people what we bought. We join groups online dedicated to identifying weird bones people found in their backyards. We are still that same bored human sitting in a parlor, trying to find a way to make the day go by a little faster. Think about the true crime boom. Why are we so obsessed with it? It is the same reason the Victorians went to see public executions or bought murder maps from newsboys. We want to look at the edge of the cliff without actually falling off. We want to see the darkness from the safety of our own homes. They did it with physical objects they could touch. We do it with pixels and audio files. We haven't outgrown the weirdness, we just digitized it. We traded the smell of formaldehyde for the glow of a smartphone screen. In 100 years, someone is going to look back at us. They are going to find our hard drives and our cloud storage. They will see our search histories and the weird niche hobbies we spend our money on. They are going to see our collections of plastic toys, our obsession with aesthetic room tours, and our folders full of memes that make no sense. They will probably think we were just as strange as we think the Victorians were. They will look at a guy who spent 5 years building a city in a video game, and they will scratch their heads. But the answer will be the same one we found today. We did it because we were bored. We did it because we wanted to be remembered. And we did it because being human means being a little bit obsessed with the strange, the gross, and the unnecessary. Whether it's a wreath made of hair or a digital collection of cat photos, it's all the same. It's just us trying to leave a mark on a world that moves way too fast. We are all just trying to find something to do before the lights go out. And honestly, I think that is kind of beautiful. Even the dead beetles, especially the dead beetles. And really, what else are we supposed to do?